Hello and welcome to the Bucket Lister podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford, along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Today we are going to be chatting with Jake Field, and Jake is one of our guides. Hello, Jake.
Hiya, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, good to be back.
So, Jake, today you've done several treks for us. Jake is one of our Bucket Lister guides and goes out on the trips with us. Jake's done several this year and has done both Kilimanjaro and Everest Base Camp. So I thought today we would look at the question, Kilimanjaro versus Everest Base Camp, which is harder? So, Jake, I don't want you to go straight away because it would be a really, really poor podcast if you just went and came out with a 10-second answer of one is harder than the other. So what I'd like us to do is look at both of the trips side by side and see if we can come up with a reason of why we feel. I mean, we've both done both of them several times. So I think we're in a good position to answer the question. So I've got some headings down. And, I mean, you've literally just come back from Kili.
Yeah, within the last few days.
So obviously that is front of your mind. And we did Everest Base Camp together back in the spring season. So let's start off by comparing the routes and looking at the duration of both of them, because that is quite a big one within the two routes, really, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the main difference is definitely, the length of the trip. So Everest Base Camp tends to be much longer. You've got a good time going up, and then you've also got the journey coming back down. Is just much longer than Kilimanjaro. Kilimanjaro tends to be, if I'm describing them between a marathon and a sprint, it's a little bit more of a sprint trip.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there are 7 different routes you can take on Kilimanjaro, and they range anything from between 5 for the shortest and 10 for the longest. And then the standard Everest Base Camp trek is a 13-day trek as a standard if you're just going up and back.
Yeah.
How do you think that makes it more difficult from an Everest Base Camp perspective then, with it being in terms of almost twice as long for the majority of routes?
Well, I think for a lot of people, the main difficulty is going to be that many days trekking continuously. That's something that people often aren't able to train as much as that continuous trekking. And it is very different. You know, when you're training for these trips, lots of people are really good at getting out over a weekend, doing 10, 15, 20 kilometer hikes. What is much harder to do is do 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers on Saturday, and then do it again on Sunday, and then again on Monday, and keep going. And that tends to be, really what Everest Base Camp is about, is, how good you are at doing multiple days in a row, and your recovery time on that.
How do you think the daily distances compare between the two treks in terms of how long you'll be walking each day?
I think base camp is longer. I think each day, in my opinion, you walk slightly longer. What I tend to say to clients is that base camp, you're going to base camp rather than up to base camp, if that makes sense. I look at it more as a trek going to base camp, like a longer journey, rather than, we're just going up this one big hill, which I've heard Kilimanjaro described as. So the distances can be slightly longer, but you do break it up, and you have lots of breaks and lots of rest.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of distance wise, Everest Base Camp there and back from Lukla is about 130 kilometers over the 13 days. And then depending on which route you're choosing for Kilimanjaro, they range, I think the shortest is about 50 kilometers. And then the longest one is about 100 kilometers. So actually, in terms of daily distances, you are doing more on on an Everest Base Camp trek, definitely, than you are on a Kilimanjaro trek.
Yeah, I'd say they tend to. So with base camp, you'll be hiking in the morning. You then stop for lunch, and you continue hiking in the afternoon. Whereas Kilimanjaro, because you're gaining the altitude continuously and a lot quicker, you hike in the morning, and then you'll stop and you'll have lunch, and then you tend not to do too much in the afternoon. You might go an hour or two onwards to acclimatize on a couple of days. But you're not going to go too much after that. It's about, recovering and adjusting to that altitude.
Yeah, I must admit, the daily distances are certainly on the routes that we do are certainly less than what you would do on an Everest Base Camp trek. I mean, I always say, like, in terms of Everest Base Camp, like I like the phrase trekking fatigue is the one that I kind of like. It is 13 days. A couple of those days are acclimatization days, as we call them. We don't call them rest days on our trips. We call them acclimatization days. You do a couple of little treks on our Everest Base Camp route on those acclimatization days, but you don't get any time really on a Kilimanjaro trek to actually relax, do you, in terms of?
No, I think you'd be fooling yourself if you say, oh, well, we have a rest day, on that day where you might stay at the same, location, and you might say, oh, well, we're going to stay there for 2 nights, so we're not going to go anywhere. But actually, it's really important to go up a few hundred more meters, again, acclimatize. It's an acclimatization day, and then come back down, and that makes a big difference. A lot of the feedback that I get is from people saying, oh, we're so glad we had those days. And sometimes trekking next to other groups or individuals that are coming up the mountain at the same time, they skip those days. And they'll tell us directly that we kind of wish that we had taken the day.
Yeah, I think in terms of the Marangu route, for example, which you've just come back from, it's actually a 5-day route. If you do it as the standard, we add the extra day on and do that as a 6-day route and have that extra acclimatization at the Harumbo hut. But I think in terms of the success rate for adding that extra day on, it almost triples your success rate for adding that extra acclimatization day in terms of that.
It's massive. And and some people that I've spoken to have said, oh, but you could do it in 5 days. Like, you could give it a go. You could definitely give it a go. But for a trip that arguably, unless it's for us, could be once in a lifetime, why would you take the risk? It's a gorgeous place. It's incredible views. A lot of people love having that extra day to take it all in.
Yeah, the first time I ever did Kilimanjaro before I'd set up the bucket list company, I got sent up when I was guiding and did the Marangu route in 5 days. And I think out of a group of 12 or 14, I think 4 of us summited because of, just people getting like altitude issues. So having that extra day certainly does make the difference. I mean, for my last 3 or 4 trips on the Marangu route, I've had 100% success rate with my groups. You had the same recently. So it just goes to prove that by adding that extra day in, does make a massive difference on your success rate at the summit, really.
Absolutely.
How do you think, Jake, the way back down makes a difference? Because obviously when you're on an Everest Base Camp trek, and it's pretty much the same as the Kilimanjaro trek, you get to the end point of the trek, either Uhuru Peak for Kilimanjaro or Everest Base Camp for that trek. And then you have to turn around and come back. And I know we chatted about this on a podcast with Dave when we were discussing Everest Base Camp and Annapurna, that as leaders, that's really hard for us on an Everest Base Camp trek because you've still got another 5 days to get back to civilization in reality. But within Kilimanjaro, you're back to the hotel 2 days after. So how do you think that plays a difference?
I think it makes a massive difference with motivation. One of the things that I try and instill from the beginning with my groups is referring to it, as our goal, as there's definitely a big goal, but also the halfway point. A lot of people will view it as the end point, and psychologically, when they reach Uhuru Peak or Everest Base Camp, they say, "Oh, we're done." And I have to be the bearer of bad news and go, "Well, we're actually only halfway." But even though technically in distance you might be halfway, the way down is much quicker because you've acclimatized, you can move a lot faster. Kilimanjaro is easier in one sense to motivate people to get back down, because you can say to them one last push, and by tomorrow afternoon you'll be sitting back at the hotel having a cold beer, and that's a big inspiration for people, a big motivation for people. It will be one of the longest days of your life on Kilimanjaro, and it is a really long day. But yeah, a lot of people hold that in their mind. Base camp, people are still on a high from reaching base camp. That they've achieved their dream, but you have got a few more days to get back down. And I think, like you and Dave were discussing, it's slightly harder to motivate people on that. But the joy is that as you're coming back down, you get to experience things slightly differently. You can take it in. You're seeing some things for the second time. Some things are still new. So there's still lots that is there to experience. So I don't look at it as the end of the trek. I just look at it as the second half.
Yeah, no, exactly. But I think, like you say, people have achieved their goal and see that. And I think the other issue as well is, and we'll come on to the altitude profile of the treks in a minute, but the way down from Kilimanjaro is much easier than it is from Everest Base Camp, because when you're coming down from a mountain, you are walking downhill the whole time. Whereas when you turn around from Kilimanjaro, from Everest Base Camp, you remember those big downhill sections that you went down on the way to get to Everest Base Camp, knowing that you've then still got to go back up them on the way back.
Yeah, I think when with yours and Dave's podcast earlier, talking about Nepalese flat and how it's a little bit up and a little bit down. When you're trekking to base camp, you're going up these hills and everyone's praying for a bit of downhill. Everyone's praying, and you get to that bit and it feels amazing. And then you get to base camp and you come back and suddenly those are all uphills.
Yeah, I mean, the walk on an Everest Base Camp trek, the walk from, well, to start with, you remember leaving Lukla and going down that massive hill.
Yes.
Right at the very start of the trek, knowing you've got to come back up that. You've got the one going down to lunch before you come up to Tengboche. And then you've got the one in the morning when you leave the Tengboche monastery to then go back down to the river again. Like, you just remember those, and probably because you've done it so many times that your guests and your clients won't kind of remember them quite as much as hard as they were, and they do come as a bit of a surprise on the way back to some people.
Yeah, they can, and like you said, the difference then is that Kilimanjaro, there really isn't any uphills on the way back. It is one of those. The main differences again is that base camp is a little bit up, a little bit down, and you're going to it. It's more of a linear thing, whereas Kilimanjaro is definitely uphill for the majority. It does plateau out at points, but yeah, uphill, plateauing out, and then once you reach the summit, it's all downhill from there.
In terms of the two treks then, and you just touched on the altitude profiles there of them, how do you think, in terms of acclimatization, each of the routes helps with that?
So I think with base camp, if we start there, so you're spending longer at altitude, which can be a pro and a con. I think the pro is that because you're spending longer at altitude and also you're going up and down almost continuously, your body gets a better chance to acclimatize to being at that altitude. The con is that because it tends to be a bit of a longer trek, is just your body surviving for that long, at an altitude. You're walking slightly longer distances. So weight loss is something that we experience frequently on base camp. Nothing dramatic, but definitely some weight loss. So yeah, I'd say that's kind of one of the main things about base camp. It is easier to acclimatise because you're going up and down, but you just spend longer at altitude. Whereas Kilimanjaro, you've got a couple of days along the trek where, as you're stopping at lunchtime, you do a bit of acclimatation in the afternoon, and then you rest. So you do have the chance to acclimatise, but that final day is just really hard. I mean, on the Marangu route, within 24 hours or just a bit over, you're kind of going up around 2,000 meters, and that's more than you'll ever do on base camp.
Yeah, I think that's, in terms of the altitude profile on both treks, you start off lower on Kilimanjaro to start with, and then you're getting to 5,895 meters within 4, 5, 6 days of the trek. Whereas on a base camp trek, you're already starting higher at Lukla, and you're probably only gaining a maximum of 500 meters in altitude a day on the Everest Base Camp trek. And because it is so up and down, you are acclimatizing as you go through the walk. So I think from an altitude profile perspective, it is much easier to acclimatize on a base camp trek than it is on a Kilimanjaro trek in terms of that, because obviously it's very difficult to climb high and sleep low when you're climbing a mountain like Kilimanjaro in a short period of time.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with that.
What would you say about, and obviously, no matter who you book your trek with, if you book it with us, if you book it independently, if you go with another company, how would you describe the food on both treks?
Yeah, there's food. I mean, food is such a big part of expeditions and trips. It's really important to fuel your body, and these trips aren't easy, so you definitely want to be taking on as much as you can. I'd say the difference also comes down to accommodation. So with Everest Base Camp, you stay in tea houses. What that means as well is that some of them have little shops in those tea houses where they'll sell cans of Coke, Pringles, Snickers bars, things like that you can spend a bit of money on and top up your snacks and your supplies, as well as being provided a meal that you get to choose off a menu. So base camp is brilliant. They give you a menu in these tea houses. You choose from there. Kilimanjaro, it's slightly more difficult because of the way that the trek is run, going continuously up that mountain. You have these camps. Your local guides and the company that you go with will provide the food for you. There isn't really the opportunity, there isn't the opportunity to purchase anything on Kilimanjaro, whether it's extra cans of Coke or Fanta or Pringles or anything like that. So a lot of it is what you take up to supplement is what you take up. But on both, they do feed you incredibly well. I've got quite a big appetite. I'm definitely a big fan of my food, and I've never struggled on any of these treks. They look after you really well.
Yeah, I think one of the effects of being at altitude, and I know I've always suffered from this, is the lack of appetite, and that's for me is the one thing that I always get at altitude. I think the nice thing about an Everest Base Camp trek is the fact that you can choose off a menu, and if no matter what you feel like eating, then you have the option to go and do that on the, to have that food. Whereas I always find with Kili is, they'll cook you a meal, you have one choice. And if you're a fussy eater or if you don't feel like eating it or whatever, then, you have got that issue of, well, that's my one choice to eat at that point.
I think that's a really good point. And actually for people preparing for either of those two trips, that's something to bear in mind. If you know that you're a fussy eater or you're a bit picky with your food, that might be something that you want to consider when packing your snacks for the trip. Is one of the people on the last trek I just did up Kilimanjaro, he knew that there were going to be things that he didn't like. He'd spoken to us and researched what the meals are like. It tends to be a lot of pastas and rices and some vegetables as well. So he just packed lots of cereal bars and flapjacks and things like that. And that was something that supplemented him. For me, with hindsight now, so like I don't suffer with losing my appetite. That's something that through experience I've realised that I don't lose my appetite. Some people do.
It's a good job you got a big jacket then, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so many people talk about losing weight on these trips. I don't seem to struggle. But something with hindsight that I now do. I'm not actually a massive fan of porridge. I've got to admit. And Kilimanjaro, they'll give you the porridge in the mornings. They also supplement it with eggs and toast and pancakes. All that stuff is brilliant. But one thing that I've done now is I'll take just a couple of the dried camping breakfasts, just a couple of the dried. And as we get closer to the top, I'll pull out. It's a little treat for me. I get to not have porridge that morning. But yeah, that would be with Kilimanjaro is you need to bring everything that you want to have with you, and they will look after you. They will give you good sized meals of pastas and rices and vegetables and teas and coffees. So yeah, that's going to be okay. But with base camp, you've got a little bit more leniency. I won't take any spare food with me because I know that I can pick it up on the trek and I don't have to carry it.
Yeah, so. Exactly. Yeah, I think, for me, it's the cucumber soup that tips me over the edge on a Kilimanjaro trek. Like those two words just don't need to go together, cucumber and soup, in my opinion. And I've never understood it, but it does continue to keep coming out on a regular occasion.
I think there's definitely a few meals, and like I say, they're all, in my opinion, they do look after you. They're all good, but there's a few things that clients have said to me after trips if we're catching up or we're chatting, and there's a few things. So your dalbat, that's one that people never forget. Your yak steaks, and then obviously on Kilimanjaro your cucumber soup.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you touched on it all there in terms of, I think, ordering from a menu is brilliant. I think it gives people the opportunity. And I think, in terms of, and I call it lifestyle on the mountain, I suppose. Like they are two completely different treks in terms of what is available to you. On an Everest Base Camp trek, there are coffee shops, there's bakeries, there's the highest Irish bar in the world. There are kit shops. There's a pharmacy. There's pharmacies in every of the the villages you walk through. So you're never without anything on an Everest Base Camp trek. And as long as you've got some money in your pocket, you can go and supplement whatever you need. And
Absolutely.
I guess on a Kilimanjaro trek, you just don't have that. Once you leave the gate on day one, that's all you're going to see until you get back to the gate on day 6, 7, 8, however long the route is.
Yeah, 100%.
And I think that makes a huge difference as well in terms of, like, you touched on the accommodation. Obviously on a Kilimanjaro trek, you're either going to be predominantly, for the majority of the route, you're in a tent. It's only for the Marangu route that you stay in the huts. But on the Everest Base Camp trek, you are always in a tea house. And in the evenings, you are in a village. When you're lower down the mountain, obviously once you get up to, Lobichet and places like that. But, even at Dingbichet, in the lodge that we use, right opposite, they've got a bakery and a coffee shop. So, when you get into camp in the evening, you can go out for a wander round, you can go and buy a coffee, you can go and get some apple pie, or you have options, don't you?
Yeah, and that's again a big selling point for a lot of people with base camp is it's got a rich history and a culture, and there's the communities in these places like Tengbichet and Dingbichet, and like you say, there's I mean we always have a few cafes and bakeries that we can recommend, because it's something that I love going to when we're on these trips. But there's other things as well. I mean, is it Dingbichet? There's the pool house. There's the pool tables that they've got up there.
Yeah.
I mean,
someone has carried a snooker table up the mountain. Like,
you'll be at 4,000 or so meters, and yeah, it's a really bizarre thing to be walking through all these tea houses and hearing people play pool if you walk past one, and seeing the bakery with people sat around enjoying a tea or a coffee. So yeah, there's definitely that that add to it, that positive. And for a lot of people, that can be a big selling point. Whereas Kilimanjaro, not so much. I mean, the Marangu route that we did, it is in huts. So what tends to happen is that everybody congregates around the dining huts, and you'll sit and you'll play cards and you'll chat, and and everyone sort of gathers around. You get to meet lots of people from different areas. But yeah, you're right. It's definitely more of an expedition feel, more of an isolated. Yeah, what you've got is what you've got, and you make do just in the area that you are.
Yeah, I mean, in terms as well, I think when you're, the tea houses, they are twin rooms generally. Lower down, you might be lucky enough to have a toilet in your room, but as you get higher, you tend not to have that luxury. Obviously, in a tea house as well, you've got a big dining area, seating area, where they've normally got a wood burning stove in there, or a yak shit stove in there, depending on what they're burning at the time. But I just find that if you've had a wet day on the mountain and it's rained on you, like when you get into your tea house and you've actually got a little bit of space to sort your kit out, hang your stuff up, dry your kit out for the next day. Whereas if you're on a tented Kilimanjaro route, like you've got a 2-man tent that you're sharing with somebody else, and you've got to get your kit in there and try and sort yourself out. So I think psychologically, like on a Everest Base Camp trek, you generally get up in the morning feeling a whole lot better than you sometimes do on a Kilimanjaro trek.
Yeah, I would agree with that. For a lot of people, just having the, almost the home comforts of a room and a bed. You might still be at 4,000 or 5,000 meters, but psychologically being able to go to your room and have your bed with your stuff is actually is a big thing, and it is really comfortable. They do well. But yeah, if you do get a couple of wet days, just having that space and being able to come indoors by the fire, dry your clothing, makes a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of if we look at Kilimanjaro, obviously, like we just said, there is only one route where you get to stay in the huts. They've now just improved those huts. They've built a lot of new ones on the route as well, and they are now, some of the huts are quite nice now. They're quite spacious compared to what they used to be, aren't they?
They're really nice. There is a couple of those places they are continuing the development and the buildings and things like that. And I mean, who knows? They've got big plans. I was chatting to some of the guys out there on this trip, and they've got big plans. I don't know if it's ever going to go down the lines of Everest Base Camp. I don't know whether they're going to put in little shops and things, but actually with what it is now, on the Marangu route, it's lovely, and those buildings are really well looked after, and yeah, porcelain toilets. There you go.
And Wi-Fi now as well.
And Wi-Fi, yeah. So when we were up there last, we got to Horombo, and it was a little bit of a different atmosphere. It was something was going on, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then one of the guys that I was with went onto his phone and happened to notice that there was Wi-Fi, and we were all chatting about it. And there was a guy sat in the corner, and he goes, "Oh, would you like the password?" So a couple of the people were like, "Yeah, please." So he went over, and this turned out to be a guy called Paul. I can't remember his surname, but he was in charge of this whole project of putting Wi-Fi on Kilimanjaro, and he was there the day before the launch, testing the systems and testing the signal. And he told us that the very next day, the Minister for Tourism was coming up the mountain to officially launch it. So we got a bit of exclusive usage of it the day before to test it. And the following morning, people came out. There were cameras and reporters, and Minister of Tourism comes up and gives a speech and officially opens it. So now there's Wi-Fi at Horombo and up to Kibo, which is your summit camp.
So the Wi-Fi goes all the way up to Kibo Hut as well, then?
So it currently goes all the way up to Kibo. Their plan long term, from what I've been told, is to get it to Stella Point next, and then Gilman's and then Stella and then they are looking at Uhuru, which is incredible. It's going to be a big task, but yeah, that's what they're planning at the moment. But currently, so with the trip that you go out with in the next couple of days, you'll have Wi-Fi at Horombo and Kibo.
Well, there we are. I'll test it out, and maybe I could do a Facebook Live and test it from Horombo then.
There you go.
I mean, how would you compare? I mean, you've done tented routes on Kili, you've done the hut route. How would you compare the two in terms of, if you had done some trekking in the UK and you thought to yourself, oh, I really fancy giving Kilimanjaro a go, which would you say was like a perfect step for you in terms of that?
I think it would depend on the style of trekking that I was used to doing. I mean, some people I know, they'll go out and they love the wild camping. They'll go out and they love wild camping. They love, trekking during the day in the mountains, getting back to a campsite. They love everything about that. And actually, on Kilimanjaro and those tented routes, that's really nice. They put up a cook tent and they stick up a table. Everyone goes in. It's a really nice atmosphere. It's a lovely community. If you're the type of person that goes out and you love being in the hills during the day, but you prefer coming back to a hostel or a lodge or an Airbnb, and you like those comforts of being able to have a shower and sleep in a bed, then I would definitely consider the Marangu route. The general consensus is that the Marangu route, with staying in the huts and having the beds and things like that, tends to be a slightly nicer way of doing it. Maybe I would say, but I think I think with the way that they do the tented routes and those campsites, and if you've got a good air mattress, there's nothing wrong with that.
As long as the weather's dry.
As long as the weather's dry, yeah, and that makes a big difference. Like you say, with base camp, having the ability to come and dry your clothes, and you can do that on Marangu. You've got these huts that you can put your clothing in and dry them out.
I think the other thing as well is in terms of the Marangu route, just having that bed, having a mattress, like just for some people makes a massive difference, doesn't it? It just.
Yeah, and that's some of the feedback I got off this last trip, is that you look forward to getting into camp. You still look forward to getting into camp because you're tired on the tented routes. But yeah, just knowing that you can stick your stuff in, you can jump. And some of them are bunk beds, but you jump into bed. The mattresses are really good. It's a lot more comfortable for people. It doesn't.
I think the other thing I like about the Marangu route is the fact that on the other routes, you're kind of not limited to how many people can be on that route at any one time, because the campsites, you just pitch up the tents, and on like the Machame, for example, it can get very busy because there is no real restriction on how many people can do it. Whereas with the Marangu route, there's only so many beds in the huts, so therefore it is a lot quieter than maybe some of the other routes.
Actually, that's a really good point. That was something that I noticed last time. The route was much quieter. And as you said, there's only a certain amount of space. I think I did see one group who came in, and I think they were doing a special expedition where they put some tents up on the side of the route, but again, really rare. So you're limited to how many people can be at those camps. So it is a much quieter route. Whereas Machame, which I did last time, there were a couple of camps which it was just a sea of tents.
Yeah. Okay, so we've kind of gone through the pros and cons for each of the trek. I think my opinion is they're both bucket list worthy trips. They're both on a lot of people's bucket lists, and for quite a lot of people, they'll have both of the trips on their bucket list. But if we had to say then which one was the harder trek, how would you answer it?
Okay, so this is a question that I get asked a lot, because it is on people's bucket list, and they are the two that I do get asked about the most, is Kilimanjaro or base camp. I've done Kilimanjaro. How do you think I'll fare on base camp, and vice versa? The way that I tend to explain it, and this is just me personally, is that I think Kilimanjaro is easier until the last day. And that's a really important little caveat at the end, because the trekking that you do on Kilimanjaro, it's less of a distance. Depending on the route that you do, if you are staying in those huts, that can make a big difference. But day to day, I do find the hiking and the trekking easier on Kilimanjaro until you get to the base camp, or until you get to Kibo or wherever it is that you're pushing to the summit from. And on that day, I do find it one of the longest days of your life, and it is really, really hard, and people often underestimate it. But you do have to dig deep on that. Whereas, base camp, as we discussed before, you'll be walking longer distances for longer, usually, so more distance, longer amount of time. But because you're going up and down continuously, you acclimatize better. And that push to base camp, although it's difficult, I don't think it's anywhere near as difficult as Kilimanjaro.
Yeah, I think I would completely agree with you there. I think, to give it the answer, I think, Kilimanjaro is the harder out of the two treks, from my opinion. I think people do get sucked into a bit of a false sense of security in terms of, like you said, the trekking leading up to the final camp before the summit is generally quite easy compared to other treks. Even Toubkal, I think, is harder than some of the trekking on Kilimanjaro up to base camp. But then, the summit night of Kilimanjaro, I mean, I just say to people, imagine the hardest thing you've ever done and you're about to do something harder this evening. I think that's one thing we didn't touch on when we were chatting is the fact that obviously Kilimanjaro as well is a nighttime summit. We are getting people up midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning to start trekking for the summit, where, you don't have any of that on Everest Base Camp, do you?
No, you don't. I mean, the last base camp trip that I did, we started in the early hours of the morning. One of the main reasons behind that was to avoid too many people at base camp. And we actually were able to experience about an hour at base camp just to ourselves, which was lovely. So we started a little bit earlier. But that kind of depends on the trip and on the day and what your plan is. But Kilimanjaro, you'll always be starting, somewhere between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. So it's always going to be doing the majority in the dark and then getting to that final bit just as the sun's starting to come up. And that's a big challenge for people. One thing I will say is that a lot of clients came up to me and said, we're really glad that we started in the dark in hindsight, because we couldn't see what we had to go up.
Exactly.
Mentally, it was a bit easier. But those hours in the morning where just before the sun comes up, gets a bit colder. But the view, it's just a trip I love. So as much as it's hard, and there might be some points where you go, this was difficult, I'm still completely in love with it. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, I think, with both of them, it's not just a physical challenge, is it? There is a mental challenge in there as well for people. And that's one thing that, if you really want to get to Kilimanjaro, I think anyone can get there as long as you are mentally strong enough. I think, it is on a lot of people's bucket lists. If it was easy, more people would be doing it. So, both of them are a challenge. But I think, the conclusion we've come to after this discussion is, you should do them both, firstly. But secondly, Kilimanjaro, in answer to the question, is a harder trek than Everest Base Camp.
Yeah, I would agree.
Brilliant. Well, Jake, thanks ever so much for coming on and chatting with us today. I'm sure you'll be coming back on to do some more of these podcasts in the future. In the show notes, I will put links to both our Kilimanjaro trips and our Everest Base Camp trips. And, you can have a look and decide for yourself which one might be on your bucket list. So if you've enjoyed this podcast today, please make sure you follow the podcast so you can be informed when the next episode is ready. Excitingly, I am off to Tanzania with Jake as well in a couple of days' time, and I'm going to try and record my next few podcasts over in Tanzania. So hopefully in a week's time, you'll be hearing from our head guide, Whitey, if I can get everything set up ready to go for that one. So thanks for listening today, and hopefully I'll be chatting to you next week from Tanzania. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk or follow us on socials. See you next time.